What's a time someone underestimated you badly? I was 22 when Professor Blackwood decided I didn't belong in his advanced molecular biology program. Not because of my grades. I had a 4.0 GPA. Not because of my research. I'd already published 2 papers as an undergraduate, but because I was the daughter of the university's head custodian. Miss Torres, he said during our first meeting, not bothering to look up from his papers. I'm sure your father is proud you made it this far, but graduate school requires a different caliber of student. I sat there in his pristine office, surrounded by his Harvard diplomas and awards, feeling like I was shrinking into the leather chair. This was my dream program. I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for undergraduate school, while Dad cleaned these same buildings at night. My research proposal was accepted, I said quietly. He finally looked at me, a look that made my stomach twist. Yes, well, sometimes we make accommodations for diversity initiatives. The words hit like a slap. I knew what he meant. Poor Mexican girl, custodian's daughter, charity case. I'd like to prove myself, I managed to say. Professor Blackwood leaned back, a thin smile playing on his lips. Of course you would. Tell you what, if you can complete my research challenge by the end of the semester, I'll consider keeping you in the program. He slid a file across the desk. Inside was a problem that had stumped graduate students for 2 years, engineering a specific protein that could target cancer cells without harming healthy tissue. Previous students had spent entire semesters just trying to understand the basic structure. You have 4 months, he said. Don't waste my time if you can't deliver. That night, I called Dad from my tiny apartment. He was on his dinner break, eating a sandwich in the chemistry building he'd been cleaning for 15 years. Mija, he said in his gentle voice. What's wrong? I told him everything. How Professor Blackwood looked at me like I didn't belong. How he'd given me an impossible task. Dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. You know, I've been cleaning that professor's lab for 3 years. I see what those students throw away. All their failed experiments, their notes, their mistakes. Want to know a secret? What? I also see what works. And Mija, I've been watching you work since you were little. That professor, he's never had to fight for anything. You have. That's why you're going to surprise him. The next morning, I started working. Not just during normal hours, I was in that lab from 6 a.m. until midnight. When other students went home for dinner, I ate vending machine sandwiches at my bench. Professor Blackwood would walk by and shake his head. Still here, Miss Torres? Maybe you should consider a more realistic career path. I ignored him. I had something to prove. But first, let me tell you how I got here. How a girl whose family couldn't afford college textbooks ended up in one of the country's most prestigious graduate programs. I was 8 years old when I first fell in love with science. Dad had been working double shifts to pay for Mom's cancer treatments, and I spent most evenings in the university buildings with him. While he mopped floors and emptied trash cans, I'd sneak into empty classrooms and read whatever textbook students had left behind. One night, I found a molecular biology textbook in the dumpster behind the science building. The spine was cracked and half the pages were water damaged, but to me, it was treasure. I spent the next 3 months reading about DNA and proteins and cellular structures, drawing diagrams on napkins because we couldn't afford proper notebooks. When my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed my drawings during art class, she pulled me aside. Carmen, where did you learn about mitochondria? She asked, holding up my crayon drawing of a cell. From a book I found, I said simply. Mrs. Patterson spent her own money to buy me science books for Christmas that year. She started staying after school to help me with advanced concepts that were years beyond my grade level. When other kids were reading picture books, I was devouring everything I could find about genetics and biochemistry. But it wasn't just academic curiosity that drove me. It was watching Mom suffer through chemotherapy, seeing Dad work himself to exhaustion trying to pay medical bills, and knowing that somewhere in those textbooks might be the key to helping people like her. Mom died when I was 12. The cancer had spread too far, too fast, and the treatments that were supposed to save her just made her final months more painful. At her funeral, I made a promise to myself. I would find a way to fight back against the disease that had stolen her from us. High school was a blur of advanced placement classes, part-time jobs, and scholarship applications. My guidance counselor, Mr. Fernandez, was the first person who believed I could actually make it to college. You have a gift, Carmen, he told me during my senior year. Don't let anyone convince you that where you come from determines where you can go. I graduated valedictorian with a full scholarship to the state university. Dad cried when I walked across that stage, the first person in our family to graduate from high school, let alone head to college. Undergraduate school was its own challenge. While my classmates worried about which fraternity parties to attend, I was working 20 hours a week in the campus dining hall and another 15 hours tutoring struggling students. I lived in the cheapest dorm room available and survived on ramen noodles and whatever free food I could find at campus events. But I excelled in my classes, particularly in molecular biology and biochemistry. My professors started inviting me to work in their research labs, first as an unpaid volunteer, then as a work-study student, and eventually as a paid research assistant. By my junior year, I was co-authoring papers and presenting research at undergraduate symposiums. My senior thesis on protein folding mechanisms caught the attention of graduate programs across the country. That's how I ended up sitting in Professor Blackwood's office, listening to him question whether I belonged in his program. The protein engineering challenge he'd given me was brutal. Previous graduate students had approached it by trying to modify existing proteins, tweaking their structure to make them more selective for cancer cells. Every approach had failed because the modifications either made the proteins ineffective or caused them to attack healthy cells along with cancerous ones. I spent the first month just reading everything that had been published on the topic. I filled 3 notebooks with calculations and diagrams, trying to understand why every previous attempt had failed. That's when I realized everyone was approaching the problem backwards. Instead of trying to modify existing proteins, what if I designed completely new ones from scratch? What if I could engineer proteins that were naturally selective for cancer cells, built from the ground up with that specific purpose? It was ambitious to the point of being crazy. Most graduate students wouldn't attempt something so risky. If it failed, they'd have nothing to show for an entire semester of work. But I wasn't most graduate students. I had nothing to lose and everything to prove. I started by studying the fundamental differences between cancer cells and healthy cells at the molecular level. Cancer cells have specific proteins on their surface that healthy cells don't have. If I could engineer a protein that bound exclusively to those cancer-specific markers, I might be able to create a targeted therapy. The work was exhausting. I was in the lab before sunrise and didn't leave until after midnight. My tiny apartment became a secondary workspace, covered with printouts of protein structures and molecular diagrams. I ate most of my meals standing at my lab bench, reading research papers while I chewed. Other graduate students started calling me the ghost because I was always there but rarely interacted with anyone. I didn't have time for socializing. I had a point to prove and only 4 months to prove it. By month 2, I'd made my first breakthrough. I'd successfully designed a protein structure that in theory should bind specifically to a marker found on breast cancer cells. But designing it on paper was only the first step. I had to actually create the protein in the lab and test whether it worked. That's where things got complicated. My first attempts at synthesizing the protein were disasters. The cellular machinery I was using to produce it kept breaking down, creating useless fragments instead of the complete protein I needed. I spent 2 weeks troubleshooting, adjusting conditions, trying different approaches. I was ready to give up when I remembered something Dad had told me years ago. Sometimes the problem isn't with your tools, Mija. Sometimes you need to change your approach entirely. Instead of using the standard bacterial system that everyone else used for protein production, I switched to a yeast-based system that was more complex but potentially more reliable. It took me another week to learn the new techniques, but when I finally got it working, the results were beautiful. Not only did my protein form correctly, but when I tested it against cancer cell samples, it bound with 89% specificity. That meant it was recognizing and attaching to cancer cells, while leaving healthy cells almost completely alone. I was so excited I called Dad at 2 a.m. Mija, it's the middle of the night, he said groggily. Dad, it worked. My protein actually worked. There was a pause. Then I heard him crying. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. Your mom would be so proud. But one successful protein wasn't enough. I wanted to create a complete system, multiple proteins that could target different types of cancer cells and work together as a comprehensive treatment. I spent the next month designing and testing 2 additional proteins, one that targeted colon cancer cells and another that went after lung cancer cells. Each one required a different approach, different binding mechanisms, different testing protocols. The colon cancer protein was the hardest. The molecular markers on colon cancer cells are more subtle than those on breast cancer cells, requiring a much more sensitive binding mechanism. I went through 12 different design iterations before I found one that worked. The lung cancer protein was the most elegant. I managed to engineer it so that it not only bound to cancer cells, but actually disrupted their ability to metastasize, to spread to other parts of the body. When I saw those results, I knew I had something special. By month 3, I had 3 functional proteins, each with over 85% specificity for their target cancer types. But I wanted to push further. I wanted to create something that would make Professor Blackwood's jaw drop. I decided to engineer a 4th protein that could work as a universal detector, something that could identify and bind to any type of cancer cell, regardless of the specific markers present. It was incredibly ambitious, but I had 1 month left and I was already so far ahead of what anyone expected. The universal detector protein was like trying to create a master key that could open any lock. Cancer cells share some common characteristics, but they're also incredibly diverse. Creating something that could recognize all of them required a completely new approach. I spent sleepless nights poring over research papers, looking for patterns that other scientists had missed. I made charts and graphs, mapping the molecular signatures of dozens of different cancer types, looking for the common threads that tied them all together. The breakthrough came at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday night when I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. I was looking at protein folding patterns when I noticed something that should have been obvious. All cancer cells, regardless of type, had to solve the same basic problem of uncontrolled growth, and they all solved it in remarkably similar ways at the molecular level. If I could design a protein that recognized the molecular machinery of uncontrolled growth rather than specific surface markers, I might be able to create something truly universal. It took me 2 weeks to design and synthesize the universal detector protein. When I finally tested it, the results were beyond anything I'd hoped for. 94% specificity across 17 different types of cancer cells. I had created something that could revolutionize cancer diagnosis and treatment. That's when I overheard Professor Blackwood's conversation in the hallway. The Torres girl is still wasting time on that project, he said with a laugh. I gave her an impossible task to prove a point. She'll drop out by next semester and save us all the trouble. What if she actually solves it? The other professor asked. Blackwood scoffed. Please. Students with far better backgrounds have failed at this. A custodian's daughter isn't going to crack a problem that stumped my top graduate students. I sat there in the dark lab, listening to him mock everything I'd worked for. That's when I decided Professor Blackwood was going to get the surprise of his life, but I also decided he needed to pay for what he'd done to other students like me. The next day, I started investigating Professor Blackwood's history. I spent hours in the library, digging through old department newsletters, graduation records, and research publications. What I found made me sick. Over the past 8 years, Professor Blackwood had supervised 23 graduate students. Of those, only 7 had completed their degrees. The other 16 had dropped out, citing incompatible research interests or inability to meet program requirements. But when I looked closer at the demographics, a pattern emerged. Of the 16 dropouts, 14 had been students from working-class backgrounds, first-generation college students, or members of minority groups. The 7 who had completed their degrees were all from wealthy families with connections in academia. It wasn't a coincidence. Professor Blackwood had been systematically weeding out students he deemed undesirable for years. I found contact information for 3 of the students who had dropped out and reached out to them. What they told me was devastating. Amelia Rodriguez had been a brilliant biochemistry student whose parents worked in agriculture. Professor Blackwood had assigned her a research project on soil contamination, then repeatedly criticized her methodology until she lost confidence in her abilities. She dropped out after 1 semester and was now working as a lab technician at a community hospital. "He made me feel like I was stupid," she told me over the phone. "Like I didn't belong in science at all. I still have nightmares about his lab meetings." David Kim had been studying genetic disorders, hoping to find treatments that could help his younger brother who had cystic fibrosis. Professor Blackwood had assigned him to work on fruit fly genetics instead, claiming it was more appropriate for his skill level. When David tried to switch topics, Blackwood had threatened to fail him. "I should have fought back," David said, "but I was so intimidated. I just wanted to survive the program." The third student, Patricia Washington, had the most heartbreaking story. She'd been working on cancer research, the same type of work I was doing now, when Professor Blackwood had suddenly changed her project to something completely unrelated. When she'd asked why, he'd told her that cancer research was too complex for someone from her background. Patricia's mother had died of cancer while she was in the program. She'd been driven to find better treatments, just like I was. But Professor Blackwood had crushed her dreams and she'd left academia entirely. "I'm an insurance adjuster now," she told me, her voice hollow. "I process medical claims for cancer patients. Every day I see the same problems I wanted to solve, but I'll never get the chance to actually help." That's when I realized my research breakthrough wasn't enough. I had to expose what Professor Blackwood had been doing to students like us. I spent the next week digging deeper. I talked to current graduate students, former lab assistants, even professors from other departments who had worked with Blackwood. The picture that emerged was of a man who had built his career by destroying others. But I needed concrete evidence, not just testimonials. That's when I remembered Dad's access to the computer labs. "Dad," I said during one of our weekly phone calls, "I need a favor." "What kind of favor, mija?" "I need you to help me find some information about Professor Blackwood. Information that might be on his computer." There was a long pause. "Carmen, I can't break into someone's computer. I could lose my job." "I'm not asking you to break in. I'm asking you to let me know if he ever leaves his computer unlocked when you're cleaning his office." Dad was quiet for a moment. "What kind of information are you looking for?" I told him about the pattern of dropouts, about the students who had been pushed out of the program. I told him about Patricia Washington and her mother's death. "That bastard," Dad said quietly. It was the first time I'd ever heard him curse. "Yeah, mija, I'll keep my eyes open." 3 days later, Dad called me at 11 p.m. "He forgot to log out," Dad said simply. "I'm in his office now. You have maybe 20 minutes before I finish cleaning and have to move on." I was in the science building in 5 minutes, running up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was too slow. Dad let me into Professor Blackwood's office and stood guard outside while I worked. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Professor Blackwood's email contained detailed discussions with other faculty members about which students to discourage. He had spreadsheets ranking students by their likelihood to succeed, with notes about their family backgrounds and financial situations. Students from wealthy families got higher rankings regardless of their actual abilities. But the most damning evidence was a folder labeled Problem Students. It contained files on every student who had dropped out of his program, along with strategies he'd used to make them quit. The files read like a manual for psychological warfare. For Amelia Rodriguez, constant criticism of methodology will undermine confidence. Suggest she's not suited for advanced research. For David Kim, assign unrelated project to discourage focus on genetic disorders. Family situation makes him emotionally compromised. For Patricia Washington, cancer research too complex for her background. Redirect to simpler topics until she realizes she's out of her depth. And then I found my file. Carmen Torres, daughter of custodial staff, likely admitted for diversity purposes rather than merit. Assign impossible protein engineering project. She'll fail and drop out within 1 semester, proving she doesn't belong at this level. I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. But I also found something else. Something that would destroy Professor Blackwood completely. Hidden in a subfolder was correspondence with a former graduate student named Isabel Chen. The email showed Professor Blackwood promising to help her publish groundbreaking research on protein synthesis, then systematically stealing her work and publishing it under his own name. Isabel had discovered a revolutionary new method for protein production that had formed the basis of Professor Blackwood's most famous research paper, the work that had earned him the Steinberg Award and international recognition. But Isabel had never received credit for her discovery. The emails showed her growing desperate as Professor Blackwood delayed her graduation and found excuses to keep her research unpublished. Finally, she'd threatened to go to the department head with evidence of plagiarism. That's when Professor Blackwood had destroyed her career. He'd written letters to potential employers, claiming Isabel was mentally unstable and prone to making false accusations. He'd convinced the department to revoke her funding and blocked her from defending her thesis. Isabel had been forced to leave the program with nothing to show for 5 years of groundbreaking work. According to the newspaper obituary I found online, Isabel Chen had died in a car accident 2 years later. She'd been working as a lab technician at a pharmaceutical company, her dreams of being a research scientist crushed by Professor Blackwood's greed and cruelty. I printed out everything: the emails, the spreadsheets, the files on problem students, the correspondence with Isabel Chen. By the time Dad finished cleaning the office, I had a stack of evidence that would end Professor Blackwood's career. But I wanted more than just his career. I wanted him to face the consequences of what he'd done to all those students. The semester was almost over. I had 1 week left to submit my results to Professor Blackwood. But instead of going to his office, I made an appointment with the department head, Dr. Morrison. I walked into her office carrying 2 thick folders, one with my research results and one with evidence of Professor Blackwood's crimes. "Carmen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing my work, "this is extraordinary. You've solved a problem that's been stumping our program for years." "There's more," I said, opening the second folder. Inside were printed emails between Professor Blackwood and other faculty members, showing his systematic discrimination against students from working-class backgrounds. There were the files on problem students with his strategies for forcing them to drop out. And there was the correspondence with Isabel Chen, proving he'd stolen her research and destroyed her career. Dr. Morrison's face grew darker with each page she read. "Where did you get these?" she asked. Professor Blackwood forgot to log out of his computer. When my dad was cleaning his office, he noticed the screen was still on. He called me because he was worried about leaving personal information exposed. It wasn't exactly a lie. Dad had called me about the computer. I just didn't mention that I'd spent 20 minutes reading every email in Blackwood's sent folder. "This is deeply troubling," Dr. Morrison said. "But Carmen, your research, this is breakthrough work. You've not only solved the original problem, you've created something that could revolutionize cancer treatment. I also want to contact the families of the students who dropped out," I said. "They deserve to know why their children's dreams were destroyed." Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. "We need to call an emergency faculty meeting. This is a serious allegation that could result in criminal charges." "There's one more thing," I said. "I want to present my research at the department symposium next week, and I want Professor Blackwood to be there." Dr. Morrison studied my face. "Carmen, you understand this could end his career? He never believed I could solve his impossible problem. I want him to watch me present the solution, and then I want everyone to know the truth about what kind of professor he really is." The investigation moved quickly. Within 48 hours, the university had assembled a committee to review Professor Blackwood's conduct. They interviewed former students, examined his research records, and analyzed the evidence I'd provided. What they found was even worse than what I'd discovered. Professor Blackwood had been falsifying data in his research papers, taking credit for work done by undergraduate assistants, and using university resources for personal consulting projects. The committee also discovered that he'd been selling research samples to pharmaceutical companies without proper authorization, pocketing thousands of dollars that should have gone to the university. By the time of the department symposium, Professor Blackwood was under investigation by the University Ethics Board, the State Attorney General's office, and the Federal Research Integrity Office. But he didn't know that yet. The main auditorium was packed for my presentation. Word had spread that a graduate student was presenting groundbreaking cancer research, and professors from other departments had come to observe. Local news reporters were there, expecting to cover a routine academic presentation. What they got instead was the exposure of one of the biggest academic scandals in the university's history. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces of faculty, graduate students, and even some undergraduate classes that had been invited to observe. In the third row, Professor Blackwood sat with his arms crossed, clearly annoyed at being required to attend. "Good morning," I began. "My name is Carmen Torres, and I'm here to present research on engineered proteins for targeted cancer therapy." I clicked to my first slide. 4 months ago, I was challenged to solve a problem that had stumped graduate students for 2 years. Some people thought it was impossible. Others thought I wasn't capable. I clicked to the next slide, showing my initial results. I'm here to prove that the impossible is just another word for undiscovered. For the next 40 minutes, I walked them through my research. I explained how I'd identified the flaw in previous approaches, how I'd redesigned the protein from scratch, and how my 4 variants had shown remarkable effectiveness in laboratory tests. I showed them videos of my proteins binding to cancer cells while leaving healthy cells untouched. I displayed graphs showing 94% specificity across 17 different cancer types. I presented data that proved my universal detector protein could identify cancerous tissue with unprecedented accuracy. The audience was captivated. Professors were taking notes. Graduate students were recording on their phones. In the third row, Professor Blackwood's face had gone from annoyed to pale to what looked like genuine fear. "This research has already been accepted for publication in Nature," I announced, "and I've been offered a position at the National Cancer Institute to continue developing these treatments." The audience erupted in applause, but I wasn't finished. "Before I conclude, I want to acknowledge someone who made this breakthrough possible." I clicked to a slide showing a photo of Dad in his custodial uniform, standing next to the chemistry building where he'd worked for 15 years. "This is my father, Miguel Torres. He's been the head custodian at this university for 15 years. He never went to college, but he taught me the most important lesson any scientist can learn. Hard work and determination can overcome any obstacle." The audience erupted in applause again. I saw Dr. Morrison wiping her eyes in the front row. "But I also want to address something else," I continued. "This research was assigned to me as a test, not to advance scientific knowledge, but to prove I didn't belong in this program." The applause died. The room went silent. "Professor Blackwood, would you like to explain to everyone why you gave me an impossible task?" All eyes turned to Blackwood. He stood up slowly, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Miss Torres, you're being dramatic. I challenged you because I wanted to see if you could handle advanced research. Is that why you told Dr. Henderson that you gave me an impossible task to prove a point? That I'd drop out and save everyone the trouble? Murmurs rippled through the audience. Professor Blackwood's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I have the emails, Professor Blackwood. I also have your files on problem students and your strategies for forcing them to drop out. The room exploded. Faculty members were whispering urgently. Graduate students were staring in shock. Professor Blackwood looked like he was about to collapse. I also have correspondence proving you stole research from Isabel Chen and published it under your name to win the Steinberg Award. Now people were standing up, shouting questions. Professor Blackwood gripped the back of the chair in front of him. You can't prove any of this, he stammered. Actually, she can, Dr. Morrison said, standing up. The university has completed a full investigation based on evidence Ms. Torres provided. Professor Blackwood, your tenure is under review. Formal charges are being filed, and criminal investigators want to speak with you. Security officers entered from the back of the auditorium. As they approached Professor Blackwood, he turned to me with hatred in his eyes. You vindictive little... Careful, I interrupted. Everyone's recording. As they escorted him out, the auditorium erupted in applause for the third time. This time, it wasn't just for my research. It was for standing up to a bully who tormented students for years. After the presentation, I was surrounded by professors and students wanting to congratulate me, but the most meaningful moment came when 3 women approached me together. They were Amelia Rodriguez, Patricia Washington, and another former student named Lisa Chang, who had dropped out of Blackwood's program 5 years earlier. We saw the news coverage, Amelia said, tears in her eyes. We came as soon as we could. Thank you, Patricia whispered. Thank you for fighting back when we couldn't. Lisa handed me a folder. These are our research notes from when we were in his program. Our original ideas before he crushed them. We want you to have them. I opened the folder and saw brilliant work, creative approaches to complex problems, innovative solutions that had been dismissed or ignored. These women had been capable of groundbreaking research, but Professor Blackwood had convinced them they weren't smart enough to pursue it. Don't thank me, I said. Thank your own courage for surviving what he did to you, and consider coming back to science. There are programs that would be lucky to have you. 6 months later, all 3 of them had enrolled in graduate programs at different universities. Amelia was studying environmental biochemistry. Patricia had returned to cancer research. Lisa was working on genetic therapies for rare diseases. Professor Blackwood's fall from grace was swift and complete. The university revoked his tenure and fired him immediately. The research integrity investigation found evidence of data falsification in 12 of his published papers, leading to mass retractions that destroyed his scientific reputation. The criminal investigation revealed he'd embezzled over $200,000 in research funds and equipment over the past 5 years. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution. But the most satisfying consequence was what happened to his precious Steinberg Award. The scientific committee reviewed Isabel Chen's original research notes and confirmed that she was the true discoverer of the protein synthesis method. They posthumously awarded her the Steinberg Prize and established the Isabel Chen Memorial Fellowship for promising young researchers from underrepresented backgrounds. Isabel's family attended the ceremony, where I accepted the fellowship on her behalf. Her mother, a quiet woman who reminded me of my own mom, hugged me afterward. Thank you for giving my daughter the recognition she deserved, she whispered. She would have been so proud of what you accomplished. My own research continued to flourish. The National Cancer Institute provided unlimited funding for me to develop my protein therapies. Within a year, my treatments were in clinical trials at major medical centers across the country. The first patient to receive my targeted protein therapy was a 7-year-old girl named Sophia, whose leukemia had stopped responding to conventional treatments. I was allowed to observe as doctors administered my engineered proteins, watching them seek out and destroy cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue untouched. 3 weeks later, Sophia's scans showed no detectable cancer. Her oncologist called it a miracle. I called it justice for every student whose dreams had been crushed by people who couldn't see their potential. But the moment that meant the most to me came 2 years later, when I was invited back to speak at the university's commencement ceremony. As I walked across the same campus where I'd once felt so small and unwelcome, I saw Dad in the audience wearing a new suit, tears streaming down his face. Next to him sat Dr. Morrison, who had become not just a mentor, but a friend. In my speech, I talked about the importance of believing in yourself when others don't believe in you. I talked about how the people who try to crush your dreams are often the ones most threatened by what you might achieve. But mostly, I talked about the responsibility we all have to lift up others who are facing the same obstacles we once faced. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, a first-generation college student whose parents worked in food service. Dr. Torres, she said nervously, I'm starting graduate school next fall. My advisor says I'm not ready for advanced research, but I want to prove him wrong. Do you have any advice? I smiled, remembering that scared 22-year-old girl who'd sat in Professor Blackwood's office feeling like she didn't belong. Never let anyone else define what you're capable of, I told her. And remember, the people who underestimate you are usually the ones most threatened by what you might achieve. She thanked me and walked away, her back a little straighter, her steps more confident. As I watched her go, I thought about Professor Blackwood, probably sitting in his prison cell, still unable to understand how a custodian's daughter had outsmarted him so completely. Today, I run the largest cancer research laboratory on the West Coast. My proteins are being used in treatment centers around the world, saving thousands of lives every year. I've been featured on magazine covers, won international awards, and given keynote speeches at conferences in dozens of countries. But the accomplishment I'm most proud of is the mentorship program I established for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Every year, we provide full funding for 20 graduate students who might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed by the academic establishment. We call it the Second Chance Scholars Program, and our motto is simple: potential has no pedigree. Last month, one of our scholars, a young man whose parents were migrant farm workers, published a breakthrough study on drug-resistant tuberculosis. Another scholar, whose mother cleaned office buildings, developed a new diagnostic tool for early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Their work is saving lives, just like my cancer proteins. But more importantly, they're proving what I learned in Professor Blackwood's lab. The most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. Professor Blackwood probably thought crushing my dreams would be easy. He saw a custodian's daughter and assumed I was weak, unprepared, undeserving of a place in his prestigious program. He never imagined that trying to destroy me would only make me stronger. But that's what happens when your understanding of human potential is limited by your own prejudices. You end up losing to the very people you tried to keep down. Sometimes the biggest favor someone can do for you is underestimating you. It means they won't see you coming until it's too late to stop you. And by then, you've already won. The protein treatments I developed have now saved over 15,000 lives and counting. The research methods I pioneered are being used in laboratories around the world. The students I've mentored are making discoveries that will benefit humanity for generations. Not bad for a custodian's daughter who wasn't supposed to belong. Every day, I keep Isabel Chen's photo on my desk next to the picture of Dad in his custodial uniform. They remind me that brilliance can come from anywhere, and that our job as scientists isn't just to make discoveries, it's to make sure the next generation of discoverers gets the chance to prove themselves. Professor Blackwood spent his career trying to keep people like me out of science. Instead, he ended up creating an army of researchers who are more determined, more innovative, and more successful than any of his privileged protégés ever were. That's the beautiful irony of discrimination. It often creates exactly what it was trying to prevent. And that's why I'll never stop fighting for the students who remind me of myself, the ones who are brilliant but dismissed, capable but doubted, deserving but denied. Because the next time someone like Professor Blackwood tries to crush a student's dreams, I want that student to remember my story and know that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything they said you could never be.